All
Dr.
right.
Castillo
Well,
and Banerjee, for inviting me. Hi to everybody. You can hear this is my strange accent that I'm speaking with. Um, so um, they did tell me when I came to the US that the weather was going to be better, but fortunately I like the snow, and it was snowing this morning in Hamilton, New York. So um, I have that kind of joy, and it's not raining, which is what, and it's sunny outside too. So those things make me happy. Um, so I'm looking forward to the conversation, and to hearing your comments and insights, both about the comics that you've seen, and also I'm going to talk about one comic today that you haven't seen. It's called Temporada, and it's by Rosauro Rodriguez. Um, and just so we know the kind of the direction of our conversation, first I'm going to talk for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, comments, discussion, however folks want to use the remainder of that time. So as Professor Castillo and Banerjee said earlier, feel free to note down your questions and comments as we go. Okay, I'm more than happy to circle back on things I've said, or look back at slides that I've got. Um, so I'm just going to share my screen right now so you can see what I'm doing. Okay. So yeah, before we get into the comics themselves, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rican comics. Before we get into the comics themselves, I want to just spend a moment reflecting on what it is about comics and graphic narratives that offer something different to maybe prose or novels and short stories, film, and things like that. So in this respect, and I was just speaking to Professor Castillo about this, I saw on your syllabus, some of you have read Tentacle by Rita Indiana, and just recently, just earlier this week, which is a novel that forms part of my larger research project, and one that my students here at Colgate will be reading later this semester too. And the connections the novel examines between history and the sea, indigeneity and sustainability, Afro-diasporic religious practices, gender and sexual identities, all of those are topics I'm going to touch on, some more than others, today. But returning to the particularities of comics, or sequential art, to use a broader term, this is something that I think about quite a bit in my larger research as well as my classes. Starting with comics scholar Hilary Shute in her book Why Comics, she points to the numerous ways that graphic narratives are a site of activism and resistance, especially in periods of great personal, political, and societal suffering. The juxtaposition of text and image, the generative relationship. I just saw something in the chat, hence why I just paused, but it's nothing that's pertinent right now. So the juxtaposition of text and image and the generative relationship between them situates the reader as an active participant in the way the narrative is created in a way that is distinct from other forms of textual cultural production. For example, looking at this splash page from La Borinqueña 1, I want us to think for a second about how we read it. We have 5 panels separated by gutters that emanate from the points of the star, which is La Estrella del Camino, loosely translated as star lighting the path. And when you read it, do you take in the whole page and then study the artwork in each panel and then read the dialogue balloons? Or do you read the dialogue balloons first and then look at the artwork? After all, which step comes first likely affects the order you read the panels in. Perhaps you construct a visual narrative running clockwise from top left round to the panel with the memorial of the full shooting, which would follow chronological order of the events depicted. On the other hand, maybe the order you read in is dictated by the dialogue, running left to right, the top 2 panels first, and then the bottom 3. Equally, as a reader, what happens in the gutters, the spaces between the panels? What do you have to do to connect what is depicted in one panel to the next? Let us consider briefly this 2-page sequence from issue 2 of La Borinqueña. The reader's eye is guided by the flow of water, and the way certain graphic elements, such as Lala's body, extend across separate panels. On the second page, we follow the movements of La Borinqueña and Lala, and the artwork suggests the reader might follow the swirl of this 2-page sequence to read the second page in a capital N shape, traveling up with Lala as she is pulled off the broken coral, to then see the pair move towards the reader, who now has a bird's eye view after La Borinquena has created a vortex in the sea. And so then the reader ultimately accompanies them both upwards as they break through the water's surface into the air, and so break the oppressive silence of this sequence imposed by the fact that humans can't speak underwater. This necessary interaction on the reader's part makes graphic narratives, or what has also been called word-drawn narratives or verbal visual art form, it makes it a particular immersive experience in which the process of narrative creation is shared between comic creators and readers in each panel, sequence of panels, and throughout the comic as a whole. The creative space of the gutter, where readers must narrativize the time and space between panels, also speaks to the way that comics complicate the notions of borders and borderlands. The gutters, while most often shown as blank space, are generative in and of themselves, drawing a reader beyond the confines of the frames around panels to interrogate this space and what it presents. As Aldama writes in his introduction to A Planetary Republic of Comic Book Letters, the gutter, the sine qua non shaping device of comics, is the space for us to imagine movement, thought, and feeling. Similarly, if we think about the way that comics engage with time and space, Jorge Catalá Carrasco, Paulo Dinot, and James Scorer write that comics can spatialize memory and use the panel structure to allow for a multiplicity of temporal moments and for moving forward and backward in time. This negotiation on the part of the reader sees comics constitute sites of memory that elicit and mobilize memories of the past, a politics of the present, and a project for the future. It is this that we're going to look at today in relation to Hurricane Maria. So we'll start with the webcomic Maria, created by Rosa Colon and Carla Rodriguez through their feminist sequential art collective, Soda Pop Comics. Created in 2007, this queer independent comic studio based in San Juan has been publishing comics, zines, and webcomics on a number of topics pertaining to contemporary life in Puerto Rico, not least the archipelago's ongoing status as a colony of the United States and the real and tangible effects this has, both before Hurricane Maria and since. Rosa Colon's work, overwhelmingly written in English, is disseminated online through Soda Pop Comics' website and her own website, as well as her being a regular contributor to the political and non-fiction webcomic site, The Nib. For comic scholar Fernanda Diaz-Basteris, and Fernanda has done quite a bit of work on comics and Hurricane Maria, so I see my kind of work in conversation and in dialogue with her. But for Fernanda Diaz-Basteris, digital sequential art becomes a social platform for the queer, feminine, independent, and bilingual Puerto Rican voice. And I'm giving translations of the Spanish quotes that are appearing on the screen. And webcomics question and challenge the perception of geographic space in the Caribbean colony. In the aftermath of Maria, this is therefore a political act that situates the artists, quote, not as victims, but rather as surviving users of the virtual worldwide portal, and which generates a deep sense of belonging and invites an international audience into a process of anti-colonial empathy, unquote. This is the case for Maria, created a year after the hurricane in 2018 and distributed as a PDF through Soda Pop Comics' Gumroad store. Here I want us to turn to some specific pages from the comic. And the first 4 pages are coming on the screen right now. So the format, size, and placement of panels, as well as the positioning of the text, all reinforce the simultaneous themes of physical destruction and confinement, the perception of time and its deconstruction, and the ways in which external forces, both physical and political, penetrate the borders of Puerto Rico in a destructive way. The comic opens with the breach of the sea wall as the grey clouds foreshadowing the storm gather across the island. The uniform panoramic panels on page 1, interspersed with text, speak to the perception that time passed slowly across the island as everyone awaited the storm, each scene a snapshot with the text describing the same moment in these different locales. The second page repeats the tripartite structure. but each tier is now divided into one large and 6 smaller panels, the wind battering each of these 3 elements we see on page 1, the trees, Colon and Rodriguez's apartment, and the footpath or roadway, though in a different order and with the color stripped away. The repetition again speaks to the interminable passage of time, its seeming elasticity, while the alternation between the battered trees and the pitch black in the smaller panels indicates the incessant penetration and destabilization of the larger ones. Again, page 3 replicates the tiers and particular elements from page 2, the trees, the neighborhood, and a roadway with similar broken streetlights. This time with the ever larger panels that depict the starkness of the bright sky and the debris on the ground expanding to subsume the written text. The narrative of daily life then becomes constrained by and reduced to waiting, where the individuality that faces ordinarily denote is replaced by footwear and rough outlines, all in shades of the same stark yellow. Of course, this theme of inescapable repetition and the mundanity of surviving repeats throughout the comic, most obviously on pages 8 and 9, with the only change in these sequences of panels that marks the passage of time being the color of Colon's t-shirt. Having moved between the personal and the collective experiences of the year since Maria, the comic finishes with a simultaneous message of loss and fracturing alongside hope and potential. The gradual disintegration of the Puerto Rican flag speaks on the one hand to the loss and fragmentation that Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican society have suffered. On the other hand, however, the red, white, and blue become faded, representing the long-term and ongoing broken dependency on the colonial US metropolis, to be replaced by an image of unity, collaboration, and sustainability from within the nation's borders, and the removal of the symbolic colonial colors from the flag. This last panel is the only one that depicts faces of 2 individuals who are not the comic's creators or people linked with the political sphere, echoing the text that accompanies the panel that, quote, Puerto Rico will be rebuilt from the inside out, not by corrupt politicians, but by Puerto Ricans, people who dealt with the tragedy with ingenuity, resilience, and more importantly, empathy, end quote. Or if I'm going to insert the words of Diaz Basteris once more, anti-colonial empathy. Before moving to Rosaura Rodriguez's Temporada, I want to spend a brief moment on similar themes that we see in her contribution to the soda pop comics post-Maria anthology, Nublado, Escombros de Maria, which we can translate as cloudy or obscured, the rubble of Maria. Here, in Cómo se dibuja el ruido, Huracán Maria, or How to Draw the Noise, Hurricane Maria, again, we see the repetition shown in Rosa Colón and Carla Rodriguez's comic, here with irregular frames to the 24 panels on page 7, which is the one in the middle of the screen. And these irregular frames suggest a greater sense of destruction and penetration. In reference to my observation earlier about the immersive nature of comics, the relative absence of words here requires the reader to translate the images into the auditory experience Rodriguez is depicting, with the chaos, destruction, and lack of light giving way to a denuded landscape once the storm has passed. To give a little background, Rosaura Rodriguez is a Puerto Rico-based artist and comics creator who has published a number of comics, both individually and with her collaborator, Omar Bonucci, as well as contributing to numerous anthologies and providing the cover art for a number of books that have been written by other authors. In contrast to Rosa Colón's overwhelmingly digital work, Rodriguez works mainly in inks and watercolors, and her current project, Trabajo de Campo, or field work, uses pigments made from natural materials that she gathers on her farm, Cabonuco, in Jayuya, which is in the mountainous central region of the island. In Temporada, Rodriguez juxtaposes everyday activities such as making art and cutting her hair in a bid to save water, with the direct effects of the hurricane on broader Puerto Rican society. Everyday life is a theme that runs throughout Rodriguez's work. After all, her 2013 anthology with Omar Bonucci was titled Días. But one of the overarching narratives in Temporada is the way it brings together both the personal and the political in a way that speaks directly to questions of sustainability, community empowerment and autonomy, and the rejection of capitalist and colonial and neocolonial projects that have long subjugated the archipelago and the majority of its inhabitants. As Sabrina Ramos Ruben writes in the exhibition catalogue of Rodriguez's work held at the Contemporary Art Museum of Puerto Rico in 2019, quote, "The narrative perspective of Temporada moves outward gradually from frustration and personal helplessness to the pain and grief of the collective catastrophe." End quote. Rodriguez began painting the images in this comic immediately after the hurricane, and entitling it Temporada, which we can translate as season or spell of time, she references both the immediacy of the hurricane and its effects that are depicted in its pages, as well as the longer, ongoing season that this hurricane is part of. The narrative moves from somewhat light-hearted everyday observations, such as life continuing as normal with her cat, or the befuddlement that her neighbor is using a leaf blower to clear the sodden pavement out against the backdrop of broken trees, to the effects of the colonial junta imposed on Puerto Rico in 2016 under the guise of ensuring debt payment. In these three panels, Rodriguez paints a direct link between the closure of 283 schools in Puerto Rico in 2018, the subsequent renting of 200 metal containers to serve as classrooms and offices, and the smell coming from container trucks is still being used as makeshift morgues for hundreds of bodies more than 9 months after the hurricane's landfall. On the one hand, after a year of a global pandemic during which local, national, and international policies have directly affected our own physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being, we as readers might be able to identify with the way that Rodriguez ties together these macro-level policy decisions with the very personal experience of banal repetition juxtaposed with tragedy, which then leads Rodriguez to wonder and think that she's lost the thread of the narrative. On the other hand, the way the personal and political are woven together speaks to long-standing structures of domination and oppression that continue to be employed in Puerto Rico. While not yet former Governor Ricky Rosselló sought to privatize Puerto Rico's state-run and indebted power grid as a solution to the month-long power outages many Puerto Ricans suffered, Rodriguez finds solace in the fact that at least his campaign signs were swept away by the hurricane. Yet, more practically, for her, the solution isn't auctioning off Puerto Rico to associates and investors through a process Naomi Klein termed disaster capitalism and the shock doctrine in the wake of the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, but rather by turning to Caribbean ingenuity to create a more sustainable and autonomous future directly connected to the land and the environment around them. Just as an aside, having looked at your syllabus, I know you're reading Naomi Klein later in the semester as well. And I'll return to disaster capitalism in reference to Labor in Kenya in a little while. But finishing up with Temporada, if Rosa Colon's use of technology and the format of the webcomic is political in its use of the virtual space as a mode of anti-colonial discourse that rejects US hegemony over the island, which is Diaz-Bastedes' argument, right? Rodriguez's use of watercolors reflects her stated objective to seek sustainable and organic ways to promote autonomy and independence for Puerto Rican residents. In the short documentary about her practice, Rodriguez says that she works with watercolors because they are transparent, fluid, they capture the movement or feeling of a space well. As weather events inherently linked to water, the depiction of Hurricane Maria using watercolors is not lost on the reader. Moreover, their use indicates a divestment from the omnipresence of technology in daily life and Rosselló's plans to privatize the power grid. As noted above, Rodriguez's current project sees her create pigments from natural materials on her farm using turmeric, coffee, clay, charcoal, and other materials. Her method deliberately combines the topic and medium of her art in an innovative and thought-provoking way. And as Ramos Ruben concludes her essay, through the permanence of memory linked to the documentation of nature, Rosauro Rodriguez's work rememorializes and renews the ancestral and still present links to the earth. This invocation of the ancestors and the earth brings us to the central theme, or to one of the central themes in La Borinqueña, a comic created by Brooklyn-based Puerto Rican creator Edgardo Miranda Rodriguez, the only creator we're discussing today who lives in the diaspora. And I should also say that Edgardo is an alum of Colgate, as I'm speaking to you from Colgate University. It's also the only comic that fits into the superhero genre, with environmental studies student and activist Marisol Rios de la Luz gaining the powers to control the wind, water, and land from the Taino spirits worshipped by the pre-colonial inhabitants of Boriken. Before we go into more detail with this comic, it's worth noting that Miranda Rodriguez published the first issue prior to Hurricanes Irma and Maria, prefiguring in a fashion the aftermath of these hurricanes. The second issue was delayed, in fact, as he switched to compiling an anthology, Reconstruction, to raise money for hurricane relief. And then this prefiguring of sorts happens again with issue 2, since the earthquake La Borinqueña causes appears in print over a year before the series of earthquakes that shook Puerto Rico in December 2019 and January 2020. Returning to the ancestors and spirituality, however, in his recent book chapter in Frederick Luis Aldama's edited anthology, Graphic Indigeneity, Enrique Garcia underscores the close engagement with Taino spirituality in order to combat the ongoing colonial narrative in post-Maria Puerto Rico and present the possibility of a decolonial independent future. As Garcia writes, quote, Taino culture is presented as the foundational stone of Puerto Rican identity and the first victim of Eurocentric ideology. With the 5 crystal tears of the Taino mother spirit Atave forming La Estrella del Camino, which, when combined, cements Marisol's connection with the mother spirit and sees her accorded the powers of Huracan, the wind, and Yucao, the mountains and the sea. And as an aside, and no spoilers here, I promise, but the sneak peek that I've had of the soon-to-released 3rd issue indicates that this narrative introduces us to more Taino spirits as it continues. Marisol is Afro-Boricua, a term that encapsulates the racial and ethnic diversity of the island, while indicating the position that Taino and Afro-diasporic spiritualities, histories, and epistemologies occupy at the center of this comic and the worldview it presents. To this end, Miranda Rodriguez underlines the connection to the sea shared by indigenous and Afro-Puerto Rican spiritualities, as at the beginning of issue 2, Julio calls La Borinqueña Yamaya, this the spirit of motherhood associated with the sea, whom he serves within the religion commonly known as in the Hispanic Caribbean as Santeria. And we know he's a devotee of Yamaya, given the blue color of the beaded necklace he's wearing around his neck here, and it appears in this panel over here too. I won't go into it further now, but the importance of Yamaya across the Hispanic Caribbean is a theme for those of you who read Tentacle. You saw it through the characters of Esther Escudero and Eric Letier, who are both initiates of Yamaya as indicated by their ritual names in the novel. Similarly, the water leads Marisol to Atave's tears, perhaps the preordained or maybe pre-illuminated path, given that her father is Chango, who in the mythology of Santeria is Yamaya's son. And in this series of panels I have on the left of the screen here, we see Chango. We have Marisol as a young child, and then her father Chango. And Chango's wearing a red shirt, red being the color of Chango in Santeria mythology. As I said, I'm not going to dwell on this topic any longer for now, but this is one worth considering, this narrative about the sea and mythology. When we're thinking about Caribbean literary narratives about water, the sea, and the writing of decolonial stories and histories in the sea. Beyond indigeneity and a direct connection to the geography, topography, and ecology of Puerto Rico, topics that both Rosa Colon and Rosario Rodriguez examine, La Borinqueña also foregrounds a Boricua-centric, anti-capitalist, and decolonial narrative through the way it challenges the policies of the Puerto Rican and federal US governments. In one particularly practical sense, At the beginning of issue 2, we see Kenya able to bypass commercial air travel between New York and Puerto Rico. She says she creates wormholes to go and visit her family. And this is a symbolic reference to the way that Puerto Ricans' movements have been severely restricted after Maria, rejecting the quote unquote natural way forward that the airlines offer tickets for $50 if you wanted to leave home forever. Now, this last quote is actually from Raquel Salas Riveras' collection of poetry, While They Sleep Under the Bed is Another Country, illustrated by Mariana Isabel Ramos Ortiz. It's not a comic nor a graphic narrative, but I include it here for the thoughtful way that English and Spanish poetry is juxtaposed both with each other and with Ramos Ortiz's illustrations, as well as the way that blank space between the English and Spanish poetry can be seen in similar terms as the generative space of the gutters in comics, as I mentioned earlier. Throughout, each English poem is footnoted with a Spanish one, but they're not direct translations, as so often footnotes are used. Here, for example, Salas Rivera references the official death toll versus the number of people estimated to have died as a direct result of the hurricane. That second number, 4,645, is what's referred to as excess deaths, which is a term that many of us have had to become more familiar with over this past year as well. So it says 64 equals 4,645 at the top, and then it notes below, and I'm translating here, because sometimes mathematics in any language lies to us or tells us the truth. One of the reasons I'm thinking about this collection in reference to word-drawn narratives is because the illustrator used extracts from Salas Rivera's poetry and images she'd printed in a collaboration with artist Erica Mena to create Gringo Desk coloring book, placing the images, the video I'm showing here is of that artwork, and the images are placed in that generative blank space, which has been excised from each page. However, as we will see, when the book Ramos Ortiz and Mena created is opened out fully, it forms the star of the Puerto Rican flag. Be that the current official flag, the black and white version of it linked to current resistance movements against US colonialism, or the star that in La Borinqueña is La Estrella del Camino, and which comes from the revolutionary flag of Lares, which is sewn by Mariana Bracetti. To return to my original quote from Salas Rivera's poetry referencing the extraction of Puerto Ricans from the island with cheap one-way plane tickets, the footnote lays bare this capitalist depopulation project. No existe un mundo post-huracán. Of course, this non-existent post-hurricane world doesn't apply to all, only to those without the means to profit from it. In her analysis of La Borinqueña, Yvonne Garcia has framed what she calls Marisol's diasporic intersectionality as a source of power or superpowers, underscoring how the opportunity to imagine figurations of Puerto Ricanness in which race, gender, and class intersect subverts dominant national narratives, both on the island and in the United States. However, to conclude this presentation, I want to return to Naomi Klein and to disaster capitalism, which I mentioned earlier in reference to the closing of schools and hospitals in Puerto Rico and the push to privatize the power grid. We see these effects in La Borinqueña too, with the overcrowded school bus a direct result of having to bus more children to school, and the deleterious effects of this policy are symbolized by the near demise of all those on board, only averted by La Borinqueña's intimate connection with the land. Indeed, at the issue's close, Dulcinea, an international company that made its fortunes from the sugar industry on the island, which is an issue that Colón has also examined, moves to extract and monetize the source of Puerto Rico's recovery in the comic, La Borinqueña herself. Hijacking the student-led project against Dulcinea's reach, white mercenaries capture the star from which La Borinqueña draws her power, that is, the symbol which combines the power of the spirits, natural elements, and ancestors of the island. Echoing Colón Rodriguez, The way they captured this source sees the superhero, who embodies the essence of Boriken, incarcerated inside the star through electrocution, using that same resource that Rosselló sought to privatize and that had not been restored to the whole island by the time the issue was published. Moreover, as Naomi Klein outlines in her book, The Battle of Paradise, following Maria, Rosselló's government sought to lure cryptocurrency millionaires to Puerto Rico with legal tax breaks unattainable in most other places, underscoring the opportunities there were to buy into new developments that reimagined the coasts of Puerto Rico as an exclusive and semi-autonomous playground for the rich. Mining cryptocurrencies is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, Klein observes, due to the amount of electricity it consumes. And while most companies would likely continue their mining ventures elsewhere, the idea of turning an island that cannot keep the lights on for its own people into the epicenter of this multi-trillion-dollar market is raising mounting concerns for crypto-colonialism. As such, La Borinqueña's imprisonment using this resource unavailable to many Puerto Ricans after the hurricane to then quote-unquote mine the star, that is, the tears of Atave shed during the colonization of Puerto Rico, speaks directly to the ongoing colonial and extractivist projects and policies of the United States that are being implemented. Yet, as each of the titles we have discussed today demonstrate, these can be challenged and rectified by a Boricua-centered, decolonial narrative that rejects colonial ways of being and knowing to focus on collective action and Puerto Rican stewardship of the archipelago. And I'm going to leave it there and open it up to questions, comments, discussion, and things like that. So thank you.
All right.